The dig at Coppergate, in the heart of York, was not glamorous. It was 1972. The team from the York Archaeological Trust was excavating beneath the site of a future shopping center. They were peeling back layers of time. They went past the 19th century through the medieval period and down into the 10th century. Here, the ground was different. It was dark, damp, and dense with organic remains. This was the Viking city of Jorvik. They found houses, workshops, and pathways preserved in the waterlogged soil. And they found pits, lots of pits. These were the latrines, the toilets of the Vikings who lived and worked here over 1,000 years ago. Inside one of these pits, they found something remarkable. It was 9 inches long and looked like a stony turd. This was a coprolite, a piece of fossilized human feces. It was handed over to Dr. Andrew Jones, a specialist in the new field of archaeoparasitology. He and his team at the Environmental Archaeology Unit took the specimen. Their job was to figure out what it could tell them about the person who produced it. They carefully analyzed it. The contents were mostly cereal bran and grains, some pollen, and a small amount of animal matter. But the most significant find was the eggs. Hundreds and hundreds of microscopic eggs. Under the microscope, they identified 2 main culprits. The first was Trichuris trichiura, the human whipworm. The second was Ascaris lumbricoides, the mawworm or giant human roundworm. These were not casual visitors. The sheer number of eggs meant the individual who left this deposit was heavily infested. This single piece of waste from one person on one day in the 10th century told a clear story. The Vikings of Jorvik were suffering from intestinal parasites. The worms were thriving inside them. The infection came from a simple, unavoidable cycle. People relieved themselves in the pits. The parasite eggs contaminated the soil and the water. They got onto hands, onto food, and were swallowed. Then the cycle began again. This discovery in a muddy trench in York was not just about one person's bad health. It was a window into the daily life, diet, and hygiene of an entire Viking community. It was the beginning of a much larger story told by the smallest of witnesses. Number 17, they lived in their own filth. Her name was Ragna. She lived in Jorvik, maybe around the year 965. Her home was a long, narrow timber building on Coppergate, shared with another family and a few apprentices who worked for her husband, a comb maker. The floor was packed earth, covered with straw and rushes that were changed a few times a year. A central hearth provided light and warmth, but it also filled the windowless space with a constant haze of smoke. Life was a cycle of tasks dictated by daylight. Tending the fire, grinding grain, mending clothes, preparing the day's pottage. Outside the back of the house was the yard. This was where the chickens scratched, where waste from comb making was piled, and where the cesspit was dug. The cesspit was just a hole in the ground, sometimes lined with old planks. It was for everyone in the household. It was only a few steps from the back door. It was also not far from the well where they drew water for drinking and cooking. Ragna did not think about this. Nobody did. It was just how things were. When her youngest son, Ivar, who was 4, needed to relieve himself, he would run out to the pit. He didn't always wash his hands afterwards. Why would he? Soap was a luxury, and water had to be carried from the well. He would run back inside, grab a piece of bread from the table, and eat it. What Ragna and her family did not know was that the soil around the cesspit was saturated with invisible things. When archaeologists excavated this very area 1,000 years later, they found what Ivar was picking up on his hands. They found the eggs of Trichuris trichiura, the whipworm. They found eggs of Ascaris lumbricoides, the giant roundworm. These eggs, passed by an infected person, can survive in the soil for years. They are incredibly tough. As Ivar would swallow the eggs with his bread, inside his warm, moist intestines, the eggs would hatch. The tiny larvae would burrow into the wall of his gut. They would grow into adult worms. An adult Ascaris worm can be over a foot long. An adult whipworm is smaller, a few inches, with a long, thin front end that it uses to embed itself in the intestinal lining. Ragna would just notice that Ivar was often tired. He had stomach pains, he didn't have much of an appetite, Sometimes he coughed a dry, hacking cough. This was part of the roundworm's life cycle, a journey where the larvae travel from the gut to the lungs and are then coughed up and swallowed again to mature in the intestines. For Ragna, this was just part of childhood. Children were often sick. The sheer density of these two types of parasite eggs found in almost every Viking latrine, from Dublin to York to Viborg in Denmark, tells the most basic story of all. It is the story of fecal oral contamination. It means that human waste was a constant, unavoidable part of the environment. People were, in the simplest terms, ingesting small quantities of their own and their neighbors' feces on a regular basis. It was in the water, on the unwashed vegetables pulled from the garden plots, on the hands that prepared the food. The parasites found in Viking cesspits are not a sign of a specific exotic disease. They are a sign of the fundamental sanitary conditions of the time. They show a world without a germ theory, a world where the connection between waste and sickness was not understood. The Vikings were tough, resilient people. They had to be. Their own homes were breeding grounds for the worms that infested their bodies from childhood until death. Number 16, their food preparation was contaminated. Eric was a cook. He worked in the Great Hall of a Chieftain near the settlement of Kaupang in Norway around 850 AD. His days were long, starting before dawn and ending after the last man had stumbled off to his bed. Eric's domain was the long fire pit in the center of the hall and the bustling kitchen area, a lean structure built against the main building. Today was a day of preparation for a feast. A ship had returned with goods from the east, and the chieftain was celebrating. Eric's hands were a blur of motion. He was chopping root vegetables, kneading dough for bread, stirring a massive cauldron of stew. His hands were calloused and stained. He wiped them on a greasy rag tucked into his belt when he remembered. Earlier that morning, he had used the latrine pit behind the hall. He had used a handful of moss to clean himself, as was common. He did not wash his hands with water afterwards. The water barrels were for cooking and drinking, not for casual washing. He went straight from the latrine back to the dough. He plunged his hands into the mixture of flour, water, and yeast, kneading and folding, working the mass into loaves that would be baked on hot stones by the fire. Archaeologists studying Viking settlements, particularly the large feasting halls, have found latrine pits located very close to the kitchen and food storage areas. When they analyze the soil from these latrines, it is filled with the eggs of parasites, like giant roundworm and whipworm. But they also find these eggs in lower concentrations in the soil of the kitchen floors and even in the residue on pottery shards. This is the physical evidence of what Eric was doing. He was a vector. The microscopic, sticky parasite eggs from the latrine were on his hands. As he kneaded the dough, hundreds of these eggs were transferred into the bread. The bread would be baked. But baking on a hearthstone is not always even. The crust might be well cooked, but the inside of a dense loaf might not reach a temperature high enough to kill all the parasite eggs within it. When the chieftain and his warriors sat down for their feast, they would tear off chunks of Eric's warm bread. With every bite, they were unknowingly consuming a dose of worm eggs. The infection would spread through the entire hall. Not just through the bread, but through the stew. Eric stirred through the vegetables he handled. This tells us something crucial about Viking food safety. It was non-existent in the modern sense. The danger was not just in the food itself, but in the hands that prepared it. The chain of contamination was short and efficient. From the gut of an infected person, to the latrine, to the hands of the cook, to the food, and into the gut of a new host. The presence of these common soil-transmitted helminths, as they are called, is a direct result of the lack of basic hygiene during food preparation. It shows that even in the wealthiest households, the great halls of powerful chieftains, people were not safe from the parasites that plagued the common farmer. The worms did not respect social status. They respected only the unbroken cycle of contamination that was a part of everyday Viking life. Eric was not trying to make anyone sick. He was just a cook, doing his job in the way it had always been done. Number 15, meat was a common source of tapeworms. Bjarni was a farmer. He lived in a small settlement in central Denmark around the year 1010. His most prized possessions were his two sows. His pigs were valuable, they were smart, they ate almost anything, and they converted scraps and forage into meat and fat. Bjarne's pigs roamed freely around the farmstead during the day. They rooted around in the woods and the family's refuse pile, and crucially, near the area where the family relieved themselves. There was no dedicated latrine pit here, just a designated spot behind a stand of trees. Pigs are a lot like humans in their biology. This means they can be infected by some of the same parasites. When the pigs foraged near the family's toilet area, they would ingest things contaminated with human waste. If someone in Bjarne's family was infected with the pork tapeworm, Taenia solium, the microscopic eggs of the parasite would be in their feces. A pig would swallow these eggs. Inside the pig, the eggs would hatch, but in a pig, the larvae don't just stay in the gut. They burrow through the intestinal wall, get into the bloodstream, and travel throughout the pig's body. They form little cysts called cysticerci in the pig's muscles. These cysts are the intermediate stage of the tapeworm. One autumn, Bjarne decided it was time to slaughter one of the sows. It was a big event. The whole family helped. The meat was a welcome addition to their diet of grains and vegetables. Much of it would be salted or smoked to preserve it for the winter. But that night, they would feast on the fresh pork. They roasted chunks of it over the fire. Bjarne was impatient. He liked his meat juicy. He pulled a piece off the spit. It was charred on the outside, but still pink and tender inside. It tasted wonderful. What Bjarne could not see were the small white larval cysts embedded in the muscle of the pork. Because the meat was not cooked all the way through, these cysts were still alive. When he ate the undercooked pork, the cysts passed into his stomach. The digestive juices dissolved the cyst wall, releasing a small tapeworm head or scolex. The scolex attached itself to the wall of his intestine with tiny hooks and suckers. There, safe and secure, it began to grow. Segment by segment, the tapeworm grew longer. An adult pork tapeworm can reach several meters in length, living inside a person's intestines for years. Archaeologists don't usually find the tapeworms themselves. They are soft-bodied and decay. What they find in the Viking latrines are the eggs. An adult tapeworm produces thousands of eggs, which are passed out in the host's feces. Finding the eggs of Taenia solium in a Viking cesspit in Viborg, Denmark, is direct proof of this cycle. It proves two things. First, that Vikings were raising and eating pigs. This is backed up by the large number of pig bones found at archaeological sites. Second, and more importantly, it proves they were eating undercooked pork. Thoroughly cooking meat kills the larval cysts. The presence of pork tapeworm eggs is a definitive sign that the cooking methods were not always sufficient to make the meat safe. Bjarne would likely suffer from abdominal pain and malnutrition as the huge worm consumed nutrients from his food. He would have no idea that the source of his misery was the delicious undercooked pork from his very own pig. Number 14, their love of fish came with a price. Svein was a trader. His life was on the water. Around the year 900, his Nar, a sturdy Viking cargo ship, was a common sight on the Baltic Sea. He sailed from his home port of Birka, in what is now Sweden, to the trading posts along the southern and eastern coasts. He carried furs and amber to trade for silver and glass beads. His diet, and that of his crew, was dominated by fish. On the open sea, they ate dried cod. But when they were in port or sailing through the brackish estuaries and large rivers, they ate fresh fish. Pike, perch, and bream were plentiful. They would catch the fish in the morning and cook them in a pot over a small fire on the ship or on the shore. The dish was usually a simple fish stew or fisky soupe. The pot would be filled with water, fish, and whatever roots or herbs they had. It was cooked until the fish was flaky, but a simmering stew does not always reach a boiling point all the way through. Some pieces of fish, especially in a thick stew, might only be lightly cooked. Svein and his men ate this stew almost every day. It was their main source of protein. In the waters of the Baltic, a complex parasitic cycle was playing out unseen. The eggs of the broadfish tapeworm Diphyllobothrium latum were passed into the water from the feces of an infected human or other mammal, like a bear. These eggs would hatch and be eaten by tiny freshwater crustaceans. Small fish would then eat these crustaceans. The parasite larvae would migrate into the flesh of the small fish. Then larger predatory fish, like the pike and perch that Svein loved, would eat the smaller fish. The larvae would accumulate in the muscles of these larger fish. When Svein and his crew ate their lightly cooked fish stew, they were swallowing these live larvae. In their intestines, the larvae would attach to the gut wall and grow into an adult tapeworm, and the fish tapeworm is a monster. It is the longest human tapeworm, capable of growing to over 30 feet or 10 meters in length. It can live for decades inside a person, absorbing huge amounts of nutrients. One of the key nutrients it absorbs is vitamin B12. Archaeologists excavating the latrine pits of Viking-age trading towns like Birka and Hedeby have found the distinctive eggs of Diphyllobothrium latum in great abundance. This discovery is a biological fingerprint. It confirms the huge importance of freshwater and brackish waterfish in the Viking diet. But it also tells a story of chronic illness. A person like Svein, hosting a giant fish tapeworm, would become severely anemic due to the vitamin B12 deficiency. He would feel a constant, deep fatigue. He would be pale and weak. His crewmates might have been in the same condition. They would have attributed their lethargy to the hard life of a sailor. They would never have known that a giant parasite, a consequence of their favorite meal, was slowly draining the life from them inside their own bodies. The parasite eggs found in the ground are the lasting evidence of this specific dietary risk that came with the Viking way of life on the water. Number 13, they carried parasites across the seas. Scatil was a settler. In 874, he joined a group led by Ingolfur Arnarson, leaving Norway to find a new life on a recently discovered island in the West Iceland. The journey was long and difficult. They packed their longships with everything they would need to start over. Tools, seeds, timber, and livestock. Kettle brought his family a few sheep, a cow, and his 2 dogs, which were essential for herding. Oh, they were not just bringing their visible possessions, they were also bringing an invisible cargo. Scatil, his family, and his animals were all hosts to a range of parasites common in Scandinavia. Scatil himself likely carried giant roundworm and whipworm, a result of the sanitary conditions back home. His sheep carried liver flukes. His dogs carried their own specific types of worms. When they landed in Iceland, they built a farmstead. They dug a latrine pit. They established their pastures, and with every bowel movement from human and animal alike, they began to seed the pristine Icelandic soil with the parasite eggs they had carried with them from Norway. For centuries, Iceland had been isolated. Its soil and water were largely free of the parasites that had co-evolved with humans and their livestock in mainland Europe for millennia. The arrival of the Vikings changed that forever. Archaeologists have studied soil layers in Iceland from before and after the Norse settlement, known as the landnam. In the pre-settlement layers, the parasite record is sparse. In the layers dated to just after 874, the signatures of Ascaris lumbricoides and Trichuris trichura appear for the first time. It is a clear biological signal of the arrival of the first humans. This is incredibly significant. It means that parasite eggs can act as archaeological markers. They are microscopic evidence of human migration. The parasite profile found in the earliest Icelandic farm sites is a near-perfect match for the parasite profile found in rural Viking Age sites in Norway. It's like a genetic fingerprint confirming the origin of the settlers. Furthermore, the parasites the Vikings brought with them had a profound impact on the health of subsequent generations. With no prior exposure, the initial settlers and their children may have suffered from particularly severe infections. The parasites thrived in the new environment, cycling between the humans and their livestock in the close quarters of the Icelandic longhouses, where people and animals often sheltered together during the harsh winters. The story of Kettle is the story of biological colonization. When the Vikings traveled, they didn't just bring swords and axes. They brought their entire microbiome, including their parasites. The study of ancient parasites, or paleoparasitology, allows us to track these movements with a certainty that sagas and artifacts alone cannot provide. The eggs found in the Icelandic soil are the permanent, microscopic record of the moment the Vikings and their internal companions arrived and changed the island's ecosystem forever. They show that you can't separate a people from their parasites. Wherever they went, their worms went too. Number 12, urban life was far less healthy than rural life. There were two brothers, Håkon and Styrbjorn. They were born in a small farming community in the Danish countryside around 950. Their life was tied to the seasons. They worked the fields, tended the few animals they owned, and lived in a small wooden house. Their diet was simple grains, milk, cheese, and the vegetables they grew. The population was sparse. Their nearest neighbors were a half-mile walk away. The cesspit for their family was far from the house, and their well was upstream from any potential contamination. While they likely suffered from some parasites like whipworm, the overall parasite load was relatively low. The cycle of infection was limited by space and population density. When Håkon was a young man, he decided to seek his fortune in the bustling new town of Aarhus. He found work as a laborer, helping to build the new defensive rampart around the growing settlement. He lived in a crowded timber-framed house with a dozen other men. The town was packed. Houses were built wall to wall. The streets were narrow and filled with mud, animal droppings, and refuse. Water came from communal wells that were often dug perilously close to the numerous latrine pits that dotted the backyards. Styrbjorn remained on the farm. His life continued much as it always had. Years later, if we could have examined the health of the two brothers, the difference would have been stark. Styrbjorn on the farm would have carried a modest burden of common parasites. Håkon, in the city, would have been heavily infested. His body would have been a host to a whole menagerie of worms. Giant roundworm and whipworm would have been present in huge numbers, a result of the constant fecal-oral contamination in the crowded town. He would also have been exposed to parasites from traded goods. He ate fish brought in from the coast, which might have given him fish tapeworm. He ate pork from pigs raised in the town, which could have given him pork tapeworm. This is exactly what archaeologists find when they compare parasite evidence from rural and urban Viking sites. The cesspits from urban centers like Aarhus, Viborg, and York are teeming with a high diversity and density of parasite eggs. In contrast, the latrines from contemporary rural farmsteads show a much lower parasite load. The reason is simple mathematics. In a town like Aarhus, hundreds or thousands of people were living in close proximity. This created a paradise for parasites. The concentration of human and animal waste was immense. The opportunities for an egg from one person's gut to find its way into another person's mouth were endless. The wells became contaminated, the soil was saturated, food sold in the market could be handled by dozens of unwashed hands. Håkon would have been chronically unwell. He would have suffered from stomach cramps, malnutrition, and anemia. He would have been more susceptible to other diseases because his body was constantly fighting a heavy parasitic infection. Styrbjorn, in the clean country air, would have been far healthier. The parasites tell a clear story about the Viking Age. The move towards urbanization came at a steep cost to public health. The new towns were exciting centers of trade and craft, but they were also epidemiological hotspots, concentrating and amplifying the parasitic diseases of the time. Number 11, their imported food came with unwanted extras. Magnus was a wealthy merchant in Dublin, or Dyflin, as the Vikings called it, around the year 1020. His house, on a plot excavated centuries later at Fishamble Street, was larger than his neighbors. He traded in fine goods, including wine from France, pottery from the Rhineland, and silks from the Byzantine Empire. He prided himself on the exotic foods he could serve at his table. He ate bread made from wheat flour, a luxury compared to the rye and barley of the common folk. One evening, Magnus hosted a dinner for a visiting trader from northern Germany. The centerpiece of the meal was a delicacy smoked eel. The eels had been caught in the rivers of the Baltic coast, smoked, packed in barrels, and shipped all the way to Dublin. They were delicious, a taste of a distant land, a symbol of Magnus's wealth and connections. What Magnus did not know was that the eels carried a parasite. Not the common fish tapeworm of the Baltic, but something different. This was the eel tapeworm, Bothriocephalus claviceps. It was a parasite specific to eels. For it to end up in a human, that person had to eat an infected eel that was not cooked enough to kill the larvae. Smoking is a preservation method, but it does not always generate enough heat, especially in a cold smoking process, to kill all parasites. Centuries later, when archaeologists excavated the cesspits behind Magnus's house, they found the usual suspects whipworm and roundworm eggs, evidence of the poor sanitation in Viking Dublin. But they also found something else, something that stood out under the microscope. They found the eggs of the eel tapeworm. This was a surprise. This parasite was not native to Ireland. Its presence in a 11th century Dublin latrine was a puzzle. The puzzle was solved by looking at the other things found in the same latrine pits. Archaeologists also found the bones of eels, confirming they were part of the diet. And in the wider excavation, they found pottery and other goods that confirmed trade links with the Baltic region, where this parasite is known to exist. The parasite eggs became a crucial piece of evidence tying everything together. The discovery of these non-local parasite eggs is incredibly important. It is direct biological evidence of long-distance trade in specific food products. It's one thing to find a piece of German pottery in Dublin. That just proves an object traveled. But finding a German parasite in a Dubliner's gut proves that the person was eating food that had traveled. It tells us not just about the trade of durable goods, but about the trade of perishable foodstuffs like smoked or salted fish. For Magnus, the eel was a status symbol. For archaeologists, the eggs it left behind are a tracer. They trace the path of Viking trade routes with a precision that artifacts alone cannot. They show us a connected world where a fish caught in a Baltic river could end up on a merchant's plate in Ireland. And they show that with these exotic tastes came exotic parasites and unseen risk of the interconnected Viking world. Magnus's dinner party left a microscopic record that would tell its story 1,000 years later. Number 10, not all their fish was from the sea. And Ingrid lived in the Danish town of Viborg in the 11th century. Viborg was an important center, but it was located inland. Unlike the coastal trading hubs, direct access to the sea and its bounty of cod, herring, and haddock was not easy. While salted sea fish was certainly available through trade, a large part of the local diet came from the numerous freshwater lakes and rivers in the region. Ingrid's husband would often bring home pike, perch, and roach from a nearby lake. Like many Viking women, Ingrid was responsible for preparing the food. A common way to cook the fish was to fillet it, salt it lightly, and then eat it without extensive cooking, a dish similar to modern gravlax. Another way was to add it to a pottage that simmered for a long time but might not have boiled vigorously. She was a careful cook, but she had no way of knowing about the invisible dangers lurking in the flesh of the freshwater fish. When archaeologists excavated the latrine pits in Viborg, they found an abundance of parasite eggs. Alongside the ever-present whipworm and roundworm, they found huge quantities of eggs from the broadfish tapeworm, Diphyllobothrium latum. As we've seen, this parasite is transmitted through the consumption of undercooked or raw freshwater fish. The discovery was not surprising in itself. This tapeworm has been found at many Viking sites. What was significant in Viborg was the sheer quantity of these eggs compared to evidence of marine fish consumption. The skeletal remains of fish found in the rubbish pits around the town were overwhelmingly from freshwater species. The parasite evidence and the bone evidence told the same story, reinforcing each other perfectly. The people of inland Viking settlements like Viborg were heavily reliant on freshwater fish. This tells us a great deal about the Viking economy and diet. It shows that their food sources were highly localized. While the Vikings are famous for their sea voyages, the day-to-day reality for many, especially those living inland, was a life dependent on the resources of the local landscape. The parasites in their guts reflect the local ecosystem. Furthermore, the heavy burden of fish tapeworm would have had a serious impact on the health of the population. A community where a large percentage of people were hosting a 30-foot long worm would be a community suffering from widespread anemia and malnutrition. Where people like Ingrid and her family would have been perpetually tired and weak, the parasites provide a grim snapshot of the population's health, a direct consequence of their dietary staples. The eggs of the fish tapeworm found in the soil of Viborg are more than just a medical curiosity, they are a detailed dietary survey. They allow archaeologists to reconstruct the eating habits of the past. They prove that for many Vikings, fish did not mean cod from the North Atlantic, it meant pike from the local lake. And this local diet brought with it a very local and very debilitating health problem. Number 9, their animals lived with them and shared their diseases. And Thora was the wife of a farmer in the Orkney Islands, a Norse settlement around 990 AD. Their home was a longhouse, a classic Viking design adapted for the harsh, windswept climate. The longhouse was divided into 2 sections. At one end was the living area for Thora, her husband, and their children. A long fire pit ran down the middle. They ate and slept on earthen benches along the walls. At the other end of the building, separated only by a low partition, or sometimes not at all, was the byre. This was the shelter for their most valuable animals, the family cow, a few sheep, and a couple of pigs. During the long, cold Orkney winters, this arrangement made perfect sense. The body heat from the animals helped to warm the entire longhouse. It also kept the animals safe from predators and the brutal weather, but this proximity came with a hidden cost. The floor of the byre was a mix of straw and animal manure. The floor of the human section was not much cleaner. Flies buzzed between the 2 areas. Children would play on the floor, then wander over to pet the cow. Thora's husband, like many farmers, suffered from a persistent cough and stomach ailments. He was infected with a parasite called the giant liver fluke, Fasciola hepatica. This is primarily a parasite of grazing animals like sheep and cattle. The life cycle is complex. The adult flukes live in the bile ducts of the liver of an animal. They release eggs which are passed in the animal's feces. The eggs hatch in water, and the larvae infect a specific type of freshwater snail. The snail then releases a different larval stage back into the water, which attaches to aquatic vegetation like watercress. A sheep or cow gets infected by eating this vegetation. Normally, humans don't get this parasite, but in the close quarters of the longhouse, the cycle could be completed in a different way. The animal manure containing the fluke eggs could easily contaminate the family's water supply or the vegetables grown in their garden plot. If Thora gathered wild watercress from a stream where their animals drank, her family could become infected by eating it raw. Archaeologists excavating Norse farmsteads in Orkney, Scotland, and Greenland have found the eggs of Fasciola hepatica in human latrines. This is a classic example of a zoonotic disease, one that jumps from animals to humans. Finding these eggs is absolute proof of the incredibly close living arrangements between the Vikings and their livestock. It confirms the descriptions from sagas of people and animals sharing the same building. This finding paints a vivid picture of life in a Norse longhouse. And it was a shared space, a single ecosystem for both humans and their animals. This cohabitation was a key survival strategy, but it also created a perfect storm for the transmission of parasites. The liver fluke eggs found in a human cesspit tell us that the line between the byre and the living room was blurry, not just physically, but biologically as well. Thora's family was not just living with their animals, they were sharing their diseases. Number 8, they tried to treat the worms, but probably failed. Olaf was a skald, a poet and storyteller in the court of a Norwegian jarl around 1015. He was a man of words and knowledge, respected for his wisdom. But for months he had been unwell, he had gnawing pains in his stomach and a general feeling of weakness. He knew, as most people did, that these ailments were often caused by serpents in the gut. It was common knowledge that people had worms. The question was what to do about them. The local healer, an old woman named Grimhild, was consulted. She had a deep knowledge of herbs and plants passed down through generations. She examined Olaf, listened to his complaints, and prepared a remedy. She went to a boggy area and gathered the fronds of a specific fern, Dryopteris felix mos, commonly known as male fern. She dried the root, ground it into a powder, and mixed it with water to create a foul-tasting potion. She instructed Olaf to drink it. Male fern is a known anthelmintic, a substance that expels parasitic worms. It contains compounds that paralyze tapeworms, causing them to detach from the intestinal wall so they can be passed. For centuries across many cultures, it was a primary treatment for tapeworm infections. Olaf drank the potion. He likely experienced violent stomach cramps and diarrhea, and he may well have passed a large section of a tapeworm, convincing him that the cure had worked. But here is the problem. Male fern is a powerful and toxic plant. The dose required to kill a tapeworm is very close to the dose that can cause severe poisoning in a human, leading to blindness or even death. Furthermore, it paralyzes the worm but doesn't always kill the head, or scolex, which remains attached to the gut. If the scolex survives, it will simply regrow the entire worm. Archaeologists rarely find direct evidence of medical treatments, but they can infer them. In the waterlogged latrine pits and rubbish dumps of Viking sites, they find an incredible variety of plant remains. Pollen, seeds, and fragments of plants have all been identified. Among them, they have found the spores of the male fern. Finding these spores in a human context, especially in cesspits, is strong circumstantial evidence that the Vikings were consuming these plants for medicinal purposes, likely as a deworming agent. This evidence tells us two important things. First, the Vikings were not passive victims of their parasites. They were aware of their internal afflictions, and they had a body of herbal lore that they used to try and treat them. They were actively engaged in medicine. Second, it suggests their treatments were likely a mixed bag of success and failure. The cure could be as dangerous as the disease. Olaf might have felt better for a while, but his tapeworm probably grew back. The constant presence of parasite eggs in such high numbers across the entire Viking world shows that whatever remedies they had, they were not effective on a population level. They were fighting a losing battle against an enemy they could not see and did not truly understand. The fern spores are a faint echo of their attempts to fight back. Number 7. Children were the most vulnerable. Anya was 6 years old. She lived in the Viking town of Lincoln, in the Danelaw of England, in the late 9th century. Her world was a small one, centered on the family's workshop, where her father was a leather worker. Her playground was the muddy street and the small enclosed yard behind the house. She played with her siblings and the other children of the neighborhood. They played with wooden toys, they chased chickens, and they made mud pies. Like all children, Anya's hands were often in her mouth. She played in the dirt of the yard, dirt that was contaminated with waste from the nearby family cesspit. She didn't wash her hands before she ate her piece of flatbread for lunch. As a result, Anya was chronically infected with worms. Her small body was host to a heavy burden of whipworm and giant roundworm. The worms competed with her for the nutrients from the food she ate. This had a devastating effect on her growth. She was small for her age and pale. She was often tired and listless, not having the energy to play for long. The constant battle in her gut left her anemic and malnourished, even if the family had enough food to eat. Her immune system was weakened, making her more susceptible to the other childhood diseases that were common at the time. When archaeologists excavate Viking-era cemeteries, they study the skeletal remains of the people buried there. The bones of children tell a particularly sad story. They often find evidence of stunted growth. They can see lines of arrested growth in the long bones, called Harris lines, which indicate periods of severe malnutrition or disease during childhood. They also find a condition called parodic hyperostosis on the skull, a sign of chronic iron deficiency anemia. The parasite evidence from the latrines provides the cause for these skeletal observations. The massive loads of roundworm and whipworm found in the cesspits would have hit children the hardest. Their smaller bodies were less able to cope with the nutritional drain caused by the worms. The chronic anemia seen in the bones is a direct result of the blood-sucking action of thousands of whipworms attached to the intestinal lining. Putting the two sets of evidence together, the parasite eggs from the latrines and the skeletal pathology from the cemeteries, gives us a grim but detailed picture of Viking childhood. It was a period of immense biological stress. Children like Anya were engaged in a constant, unseen war with internal parasites from the moment they began to crawl. Many did not survive. The high rates of infant and child mortality in the Viking Age were not just due to big dramatic diseases, but also to the silent draining effect of chronic parasitic infection. The worms were a constant drag on their health, stunting their growth and making them vulnerable. The parasites tell us that just surviving to adulthood in the Viking world was a major achievement. Number 6, the famous Viking cleanliness was a myth. The Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan met a group of Vikings, the Rus, on the Volga River in 922. He wrote about them in his journal. He was fascinated and at times disgusted. He noted that they were tall and strong, but also that they were the filthiest of God's creatures. He described a daily ritual where a servant would bring a large bowl of water in the morning. The master of the house would wash his face, comb his hair, and then spit and blow his nose into the water. Then the bowl was passed to the next person who did the same, and so on, until everyone in the household had used the same dirty water. For a long time, this account was contrasted with another popular image of the Vikings. Archaeological digs have turned up a huge number of personal grooming items. Combs, tweezers, and even smaller spoons for cleaning out wax are some of the most common finds in Viking graves and settlements. And this led to a popular idea that the Vikings were actually quite clean and well-groomed, especially compared to other Europeans of the time. The English cleric John of Wallingford even complained around 1220 that the Vikings were too popular with English women because they combed their hair daily, bathed every Saturday, and changed their clothes often. So, which is it? Were they filthy, as Ibn Fadlan claimed, or clean, as the combs suggest? The parasites found in their latrines provide a definitive answer. They were both. The Vikings were clearly concerned with their personal appearance. They valued well-kept hair and beards. A finely carved bone comb was a common and prized possession. This was about looking good. It was about social presentation. But their concept of cleanliness was completely different from our modern germ theory-based understanding. They could not see the microscopic world of bacteria and parasite eggs, so to them, clean meant things you could see. It meant having neat hair, a tidy beard, and no visible dirt on your clothes or body. The parasite evidence shows the limit of this view. A Viking man could spend the morning carefully combing his hair and beard, using tweezers to pluck stray hairs, and still have hands contaminated with whipworm eggs from a visit to the latrine. He could take his weekly bath and then sit down to a meal of undercooked pork and infect himself with a tapeworm. The internal environment of his body was, by our standards, incredibly unclean. The latrines of Viking York and Dublin, used by these same comb-carrying, bath-taking people, are some of the most parasite-rich archaeological contexts ever found. The parasites resolve the contradiction. They show us that the Vikings were focused on macroscopic cleanliness, grooming, and appearance. They had no concept of microscopic hygiene, sanitation, and preventing the spread of disease. They could be well groomed and at the same time massively infected with intestinal worms. Ibn Fadlan was judging them by his own culture's standards of hygiene, which included washing with running water. The parasites allow us to judge them by a biological standard, and by that standard, despite all the combs, their world was a very dirty place indeed. Number 5, their toilets were not composted. When archaeologists first started excavating the deep, organic, rich pits in Viking towns, there was some debate about what they were. One theory was that they were composting pits. The idea was that the Vikings were piling their waste food scraps, human feces, animal manure into these pits to create fertilizer for their garden plots. It seemed like a plausible system of recycling nutrients. If this were true, it would suggest a sophisticated understanding of agriculture and waste management. The study of the parasites within these pits effectively proved this theory wrong. The process of composting generates heat. As microorganisms break down the organic material, the temperature inside a properly managed compost pile can rise significantly, often exceeding 60 to 70 degrees Celsius, 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. This heat is crucial It kills pathogens, and importantly, it kills parasite eggs. The tough, resilient eggs of whipworm and roundworm cannot survive being cooked at these temperatures for a sustained period. If the Viking pits had been active compost heaps, the archaeoparasitologists who examined the material would have found very few, if any, intact parasite eggs. The heat would have destroyed them. Instead, they found the opposite. They found a mind-boggling number of perfectly preserved eggs. In the famous Lloyd's Bank coprolite from York, there were over 800 whipworm eggs per gram of material. The cesspits were full of them, layer after layer. This finding was conclusive. The pits were not composts, or they were simple cesspits or latrines. They were holes in the ground where waste was dumped and left to accumulate. There was no management, no turning of the pile to aerate it, no process that would have generated the kind of heat needed for true composting. The material just sat there, a cold, anaerobic mass. This was the perfect environment for preserving organic remains, which is why these pits are such an archaeological treasure trove. But it was also the perfect environment for preserving parasite eggs, keeping them viable and infectious for long periods. So, what happened to the contents of the pits? When a pit became full, it was likely just covered over with a layer of earth, and a new one was dug nearby. In some cases, the contents might have been dug out and spread on fields, but if they did this, they were not spreading benign fertilizer. They were spreading a concentrated slurry of infectious parasite eggs all over their crops. This would have made the problem of food contamination even worse, completing the cycle of infection in the most efficient way imaginable. The parasites, therefore, give us a clear insight into Viking waste management. They did not have a composting system. They had a disposal system, and it was a system that concentrated disease-causing organisms right in the middle of their living spaces. The perfect preservation of the eggs that infested their bodies shows that their compost heaps were not heaps of compost at all. They were biological time bombs. Number 4, they carried a mysterious parasite from Asia. Einar was a guardsman, one of the elite Varangian Guard, serving the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople in the early 11th century. He had traveled the great river routes from Scandinavia down through what is now Russia and Ukraine, a journey known as the route from the Varangians to the Greeks. He had seen the great cities of Kiev and Constantinople, places of unimaginable wealth and size compared to his home village in Sweden. He had fought for the emperor, earned a great deal of silver, and was now on his way home. His journey took him back through the bustling trade networks that crisscrossed Eastern Europe. He stopped at trading posts, ate strange foods, and drank water from many different sources. At some point during his long travels, he picked up a new internal companion. It was a parasite called the giant kidney worm, Diactophyma renale. This is a fearsome parasite, primarily of fish-eating mammals like mink and dogs. The adult worms, which can be up to a meter long and are a startling blood-red color, live in the kidneys of their host, usually completely destroying one of them. Humans can become infected by eating raw or undercooked freshwater fish that contain the larval stage of the worm. The parasite is rare in humans, but when infections occur, they are devastating. It is endemic to certain regions of the world, but it is not found in Western Europe. Its natural range includes parts of Asia and Eastern Europe. Now let's travel forward in time to the 1980s to an excavation at a Viking Age site in Skara, Sweden. Archaeologists are examining the contents of a cesspit. Under the microscope, they find the usual collection of whipworm and roundworm eggs. But then they see something different. A single large lemon-shaped egg with a thick pitted shell. It is unmistakable. It is the egg of the giant kidney worm, Diactophyma renale. This single egg in a Viking latrine in Sweden is a bombshell. This parasite should not be there. It tells the story of a person, someone like our guardsman Einar, who traveled far to the east into the endemic range of this worm, became infected, and then traveled all the way back home to Sweden. The worm matured inside him, likely destroying one of his kidneys. The adult worm would then release its eggs into the urine. If the person urinated in or near the cesspit, the eggs would end up in the archaeological record. This one microscopic egg is a piece of hard biological evidence for the incredible distances the Vikings traveled. It confirms the historical accounts of the Varangian Guard and the Great Eastern trade routes. It's a biological passport proving that someone from this community in Sweden had been to a specific, distant part of the world where this parasite exists. It's a more personal and visceral piece of evidence than a Byzantine coin found in a hoard. A coin can be traded from hand to hand. A parasite egg in a latrine had to come from a person who was physically present. It's the story of a long and arduous journey, a story of exposure to new environments and new diseases, a story that ended back home, leaving behind a single microscopic clue that would wait 1,000 years to be discovered. Number 3, whales were on the menu. The settlement at Hofstadr in northern Iceland was a grand one. In the late 10th century, it was the site of a huge feasting hall, one of the largest ever found from the Viking Age. It was clearly the home of a powerful chieftain who hosted large gatherings for his followers. The archaeological remains around the hall speak of lavish consumption. The animal bone assemblages are dominated by cattle, a high-status meat, rather than the more common sheep. But the diet at Hofstadr was not limited to farm animals. The chieftain and his guests also ate food from the sea. This was Iceland, after all. Fish and seals were a part of their diet, but an even greater prize was sometimes available. The sagas speak of whale strandings as a huge boon to a community. A single beached whale could provide tons of meat and blubber, a massive windfall of resources. In a latrine pit associated with this great feasting hall, scientists were analyzing the preserved waste for parasite eggs. They found the things they expected: human roundworm, whipworm, and animal parasites that confirmed the close living quarters. But they also found the eggs of a tapeworm from the genus Diphyllobothrium. This was not the common broadfish tapeworm D. latum, found in freshwater fish. These eggs were subtly different. They belonged to species like Diphyllobothrium stemmocephalum or Diphyllobothrium cordatum. These are tapeworms that use marine mammals, seals, dolphins, and whales' fans as their final hosts. Finding these specific marine mammal tapeworm eggs in a human latrine is an extraordinary discovery. A human cannot get these parasites from eating regular fish. The only way for a person to become infected is to eat the raw or undercooked flesh of an infected marine mammal. The presence of these eggs at Hofstadr is direct, conclusive proof that the people at this high-status site were eating whale or seal meat. This is a case where parasites provide dietary information that is almost impossible to get otherwise. While whale bones have been found at some Viking sites, they are not always present. A community might butcher a stranded whale on the beach and carry the meat back to the settlement, leaving the bones behind. So the absence of bones doesn't mean they weren't eating whale. The parasite eggs, however, are an indelible record. They pass through the gut of a person who had eaten the infected meat. It confirms the stories in the sagas about the importance of whales. And it tells us something about their food preparation. Just like with their pork and freshwater fish, they were not always cooking whale meat thoroughly. The practice of eating lightly cooked, salted, or even raw meat was common enough to allow the transmission of these tapeworm larvae. The image it creates is vivid. A great feast in the chieftain's hall at Hofstadr, the fire roaring, stories being told. And on the table, alongside the roast beef, are chunks of whale steak, perhaps only lightly seared, a rare and prized delicacy. The microscopic eggs left behind in the toilet pit a day later are the enduring menu from that feast, a testament to the diverse and opportunistic diet of the Icelandic Vikings, and their willingness to eat whatever the land and the sea provided. Number 2. The Lloyd's Bank coprolite was not from a human. The story of the Lloyd's Bank coprolite is famous in archaeological circles. Discovered in 1972 at the Coppergate excavation in York, the 9-inch long fossilized feces became a celebrity artifact. It was analyzed by Dr. Andrew Jones and his team, who found it was packed with hundreds of eggs from whipworm and giant roundworm. For decades, it was presented in museums and books as the quintessential example of a Viking diet and their heavy parasite load. It was held up as the largest and most complete ancient human stool ever found. It was quite simply the world's most famous turd. The story was simple and compelling. A Viking in 10th century Jorvik, likely a man, ate a meal of mostly bread and grains, and was suffering from a massive worm infection. It became a cornerstone of our understanding of health and diet in the Viking Age. The problem is, the story was probably wrong. Decades after the initial analysis, new techniques became available. Scientists can now analyze ancient DNA and proteins preserved in archaeological remains. A team of researchers decided to revisit the famous coprolite. They used a technique called paleoproteomics, which can identify proteins from different species. They were expecting to confirm that the coprolite was human and perhaps learn more about the person's diet. The results were a complete shock. The analysis of the proteins preserved in the coprolite did not show a strong human signal. Instead, the protein profile was a much closer match to that of a canid, specifically a wolf or a large dog. There were also some pig proteins mixed in. The evidence pointed towards a new conclusion. The most famous human coprolite in the world was most likely produced by a very large dog, or possibly a wolf, that had been eating a lot of grain-based food, perhaps scraps or slop fed to it by humans, and also some pork. This changes the interpretation completely. The massive number of whipworm and roundworm eggs are still there. But they are likely the dog-specific or pig-specific versions of these parasites, which are visually very similar to the human ones under a microscope. It means that the dogs and pigs living in Viking York were also riddled with parasites, which is not surprising. So what does this mean? It doesn't undo all the other evidence. Thousands of other samples from Viking latrines are definitively human and show the same patterns of parasitic infection. The general conclusions about Viking health and hygiene remain unchanged, but it does change the story of this specific iconic artifact. The new analysis tells a different but equally interesting story. It paints a picture of urban animals in Jorvik living in close proximity to humans, eating their refuse, and suffering from similar parasitic diseases. A large dog or a captive wolf living in a crowded city, eating human food, would have been exposed to the same contaminated environment. Its waste, deposited in a latrine pit, became part of the same archaeological record. The re-evaluation of the Lloyd's Bank coprolite is a powerful lesson in scientific progress. It shows that we must always be willing to question old conclusions as new techniques emerge. The story is no longer about a specific worm-ridden Viking. It's now a story about the urban ecosystem of Jorvik as a whole. A place where the lives, diets, and diseases of humans and their animal companions were deeply intertwined. And it's a story about how science continually refines our understanding of the past, sometimes by overturning its most famous tales. Number 1, the parasites are still with us. It is easy to look at this evidence and feel a sense of distance. We read about the Vikings and their whipworms, tapeworms, and flukes, and we see it as part of a distant, grimy past. Or we have modern sanitation, clean water, and an understanding of germ theory. These are problems, we think, that belong to the 10th century. But this is a dangerously complacent view. The parasites that plagued the Vikings are not extinct. They are not historical curiosities. Ascaris lumbricoides, the giant roundworm, currently infects an estimated 800 million to 1.2 billion people worldwide. Trichuris trichura, the whipworm, infects another 600 to 800 million people. These are not small numbers. These are global health crises happening right now. The vast majority of these infections occur in developing countries, in communities that lack the very things the Vikings lacked: effective sanitation systems and access to clean drinking water. A child living today in a rural village in parts of sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia faces the same biological reality as Anya, the 6-year-old in Viking Lincoln. They play in contaminated soil. They drink water from unsafe sources. They become infected with the same worms. These worms stunt their growth, cause malnutrition and anemia, and impair their cognitive development. The story told by the Viking latrines is not just a history lesson, it is a contemporary public health bulletin. It shows the consequences of a breakdown in the barrier between human waste and human life. Even in wealthy, developed nations, these parasites have not been entirely vanquished. Outbreaks of foodborne parasites still occur. Tapeworm infections from undercooked meat, while rare, still happen. The global trade in food means that parasites once confined to specific regions can travel the world, just as the eel tapeworm traveled to Viking Dublin. The study of Viking parasites, therefore, serves a dual purpose. It opens a unique and intimate window into the daily lives and health struggles of the people of the past. It tells us what they ate, how they lived, where they traveled, and what ailed them. It grounds their epic stories in the gritty reality of biology. But it also does something else. It holds up a mirror to the present. The microscopic eggs preserved in the mud of York and Viborg are a stark reminder of the fundamental importance of public health infrastructure. They show us what happens when sanitation fails. The world of the Vikings, in a biological sense, is not as far away as we might like to think. The same worms that lived in their guts are still thriving in the guts of hundreds of millions of people today. The battle the Vikings were fighting against their unseen internal enemies is a battle that, for a significant portion of humanity, is still being waged every single day. The lesson from the Latrines is not just about them, it is about us.